Faith in adversity. That's our theme this month, and I want to share a story with you found in the book of Mark about a couple of people that had faith despite adversity. It had been 12 years, and for 12 years, this lady had been seeing doctor after doctor after doctor. And it got to the point, since she didn't have Obamacare or Biden care or whatever they call it, that she had spent all of her money trying to stop bleeding. And she was at a point of desperation. But she had heard rumors about a man that possibly could make her well. There's another man who had been raising a daughter, and she was 12 years old. And he also is at a point of desperation because his little girl is knocking on death's door. What do you do? Faith in adversity. I think that the first thing that we see about these two individuals that we're going to read about is that they had fear. They had fear, and obviously, the fear of this woman as she approaches Jesus. I mean, she had the fear, what if Jesus doesn't heal me? What if Jesus can't heal me? And she also had this fear, what if he thinks I'm unclean? And what if he refuses to heal me? Because after all, under Jewish law, you're unclean. If you have this discharge of blood, you're unclean. Similar fear for this father of this little girl. What if this man, he can't heal her? Or worse yet, what if this little girl that I've been raising, that I cherish, me and my wife, what if she dies before he gets to her? Fear. Let's begin and let's read this passage. It's quite lengthy, but stick with me. We're actually going to begin in verse 21, and we're going to read all of this together, and then we're going to come back to this idea of fear. So let's begin reading. And when Jesus had crossed in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians and spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, "If I even touch his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And when Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, here came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, he says, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house with the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the little girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them not that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Incredible, isn't it? Absolutely incredible. But their stories, really, both of them begin with, again, this idea of fear. We see the fear in verse 21 or verse 22. We see the fear of this woman as she comes up behind him, right? Isn't that strange? Verse 27, she comes up behind him and touches the hem of his garment. You know, this is unlike any other miracle. Why wouldn't she just boldly come up to Jesus and say, "You know, Jesus, here I am, make me well"? My personal opinion, take it for what it is, I think she was a little afraid. So she kind of eases on in. She grabs him by the hem of his garment. Fear. And we also see in verse 33, she came to him in fear. Look at what it says. In fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. You know, what was she thinking? You know, if we could get into her mind, what was she thinking at this particular moment? What was she so afraid of? You know, fear is good. Fear is good. You tell that little child, "Hey, don't touch that stove," right? It's hot. What happens? Well, a lot of times they don't really believe you until they touch it for themselves. And then all of a sudden there's this fear of things that are hot. Or, you know, for instance, you say, "Don't do that," or you're going to get a whooping, right? Not a spanking, right? A whooping. Don't do that. And they don't believe you, so they test you. They do it anyway. And lo and behold, here comes the whooping. Next time, there's a little bit of fear. You know, fear is good. It's a good motivator. And so it is with our spiritual lives. You know, fear of God, knowing who God is and what he is capable of doing and who the terrifying being is, and the fear of hell. I mean, those are good motivators. You ask, like Ryan said a few weeks ago, you ask a lot of the teenagers, you know, "Why are you here?" "Well, I just don't want to go to hell." I mean, that is a good motivator. You read about hell in Revelation chapter 21. Very quickly in verse 8, he says, "For as the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion shall be in the lake." Look at this. "The lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." I mean, it's not a place you want to go. Having a fear of hell is a good motivator. It is a good thing. But as you grow up, it's no longer about the whoopings, is it? It's about, you know, pleasing mama or daddy. That's part of the maturing process. You read this passage with me, you move from fear, you grow into respect. You grow into admiration. Matthew, look at what he says here. In Matthew chapter 10, Look at this in verse 28. And do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. You know, there again is our fear of God. But our fear of God, it morphs into being scared and terrified. You know, I don't want to be on his bad side. It morphs into a respect and an admiration. And I believe that's how we balance in our Christian lives. What we read here in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28 with what we also read, John says to us in 1 John chapter 4. Because it seems, at first glance, it seems a little contradictory. But look at what he says there. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment. And whoever fears has not been perfected in love. So there's this balancing act as we as Christians, you know, we strive to please God. Because, you know, I don't want to get on God's bad side. I mean, rightfully so. You know, just like I didn't want to get on my daddy's bad side. Story time with Uncle John. There was one time I was about 12 years old. We had cows, all right? And our neighbor had cows. Well, we decided to go down the road however long, and we stopped right there, and my brother said, hey, let's get some rocks and let's throw it at these cows. Well, we did. All right, we got rocks and we started chunking at our neighbor's cows. We started throwing these rocks. All right, not a big deal. You know, ground beef tomorrow, okay? So these cows somehow told our father what we had been doing. And guess what? We got whoopings. That's about the last time that I remember my dad giving me a whooping. It moves from fear to, I don't want to do that again, right? To respect and admiration. So perfect love, we recognize God as this terrifying being that is capable of destroying, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 28, destroying both body and soul in hell, right? I mean, I don't want to be a part of that. But also, on the other end of the spectrum, God so loved the world that he sent his only son. I mean, how could you possibly ever want to disappoint someone who has sacrificed his own son for you? Perfect love, here's our balance. Perfect love, it casts out fear. So as a Christian, it has more to do with a respect and an admiration for God than a terrifying being that sits high in the sky and watches over humanity. But this is how these people began. This woman with a discharge of blood, we don't know her name, in Jairus, it began with fear. But fear morphed into faith. You know, they believed that Jesus was capable of doing everything that they had heard that he was doing. Let's go back and look at the story again, back in Mark chapter 5, and look at their faith as Mark records it for us. For instance, look at verse 23 with me. Look at what it says there. And implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. He had faith. He had faith. Jesus, you come here, and when you come lay your hands on her, she's going to be alive. I mean, she's going to live again. She's going to be well. He had total faith that Jesus was capable of doing what he had heard about. And you remember there in verse 36, what Jesus' reply to him was, do not fear, only believe, right? Have faith. Believe that I'm capable. Believe that this is able to be done. And this woman, look at this woman in verse 28, you know, her faith, for she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. Now, I'm going to make a proposition to you, okay? I propose that this woman had even more faith than this man did. Because, and this is my reasoning, this is my opinion, strictly my opinion. If I even touch his garments, I will be made well. And you remember what Jairus said? Jesus, come and lay your hands on her. There's a difference here. This woman believed that Jesus had the passive power, right? And this man, this ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, he believed that Jesus had the active power, that Jesus had to be directly focused on his little girl. And this woman said, hey, this guy has enough power that if I even just touch his garments, I'm going to be made well. But both of them had faith, an incredible amount of faith. But faith, it demands action. What if these two people, what if they said, Jesus is capable of doing this. Jesus is capable of healing our daughter. Jesus is capable of healing me from my disease. And they sat on their hands and they never went anywhere or did anything. Would that do them a lick of good? It would be useless, right? To have the faith that Jesus is capable of doing something, but doing nothing about it. It doesn't make any sense. So faith, we see here, faith demands that we do something about our faith. Read a few passages with me very quickly. In James chapter 2, it's just saturated in this passage. But look at verse 14. What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? No, you got to do something about it. Look at verse 17. So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Well, show me your faith apart from your works, and I will show you my faith by my works. Verse 22, you see that faith was active along with his works. Talking about Abraham, and his faith was completed by his works. In verse 26, for as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Faith demands action. You can believe that God is who he claims to be, but if you do nothing about it, what good is it? You can claim that Jesus has the power to heal and Jesus has the power to save you, but if you do nothing about it, what good is that? Faith, it demands that you do something. That's why Paul, as he opens up his epistle to the Romans in chapter 1, he says in verse 16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. There's our word. To everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, the gospel, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed, look at this, from faith for faith. It is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Live by faith. If you've got faith, you've got to prove it. Right? We're on the same page. It's silly to say that, I believe that God is God. I believe that he created everything. But if you have nothing in your life that proves that you believe it, it means nothing. Similarly, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7, this is what Paul writes. Again, he says in verse 7, for we walk by faith and not by sight. Pretty simple. Our life, we live by faith, we walk by faith. Your life, if we could put this in a different way, your life is guided by your faith. Everything that you do is guided by your faith. That's the way it ought to be. That's the way that the Christian life is supposed to be. Live by faith. You believe that God is who he claims to be? Live it. Don't just say it, live it. Their fear Their fear motivated them to believe in God, motivated them to have this faith. And their faith, it fixed them. Yet I had to have another F in there. It healed them. It fixed them. Let's go back and look at a few more verses there in Mark. Verse 29. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And if we don't stop there, tag along with verse 29, verse 34. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. Your faith has made you well. Verse 41 and verse 42, we're back to Jairus. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they immediately were overcome with amazement. Their faith fixed them. Their faith led to their healing. I don't know what's going on in your world. I don't know what's going on in many of your lives. But if I had to guess, I would say some of us have something right now that we're anxious about. Let's not use worry, but we're anxious about, that we're on edge about. Something, I don't know what it is. Maybe you're looking forward to retirement, and you're looking at the stock market and you're like, well, I don't know if we can do this. Or maybe you're in your job and you're working in your job and you're thinking, I don't know if I can do this. Or maybe you're struggling in your marriage and you're at a point, I don't know if I can do this. Let's set all those aside. Put those on the back burner. And let me ask you a question. What is the greatest problem that we face today? If you could pick out one thing, what would it be? In the world, in the globe. Let's go broader than Evansville, broader than America. In the globe. Hunger. Absolutely. AIDS, that's running all over Africa. Lack of clean water. Or maybe the political air of today. The biggest problem, I'm going to solve all the world's problems. Just listen. The biggest problem that we're facing is a 3-letter word that starts with an S. Sin. That's it. You take away sin from the world, all the problems are solved. There's no more war. There's no more hate. There's no more animosity. There's no more riots. There's no more storming the streets. There's no more murders. There's no more rapes. There's no more. You take away. Prisons are empty if we take away sin. Biggest problem in the world is sin. Because if we followed what God has asked us to follow, it is love God, love your neighbor. If we loved God and if we love our neighbor, aren't all the problems solved? The biggest problem that you face and that I face, the world faces, is sin. But the solution is so simple. It's right here in front of us. The man has healed a woman with a discharge of blood. The man has raised a little 12-year-old from the dead. This is the solution. This is the healing for the world. This is the healing for you and for me. What is exciting about this is what we read in Romans chapter 5 and verse 9. You know, it's kind of the opposite of what happens here in this story in Mark chapter 5. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 9, it's there on the screen if you want to read it with me. Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God. This woman came to Jesus with a flow of blood. Follow me? It is the flow of blood from Jesus that saves you. Jesus then proceeds, after this woman has been healed of her disease, and our disease is sin, healed by the flow of Jesus' blood. He proceeds to go to this little dead girl. Let's go to another passage, Ephesians chapter 2. Look at verse 1 with me. And you were, look at it, dead in the trespasses and sins. You're dead. You're dead. You continue reading. He picks his thought back up there in verse 4. And this is what he says there. But God, being rich in mercy, because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. You see, Jesus raised that little girl from the dead. And Jesus, by the grace of God, raises us from the dead sin, our dead lives, as we let sin live in us. Is it? Pretty simple. We've got the solution. The greatest problem in the world, hey, it's solved right here. Love God, love your neighbor. Get rid of sin in your life. Allow the flow of Jesus' blood to save you. Be baptized. Have your sins washed away. Wake up, rise up, a new creation. Loving God, loving your neighbor. It's solved with this little 12-year-old girl. And it's solved with this woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years. The solution? Jesus. If you need Jesus in your life, if you need to come to him to be baptized, or if you need to begin walking a new life, starting all over, now is the time to do it as we stand and sing.